He didn't yell. He didn't need to. In a ballroom filled with diamonds and champagne, George Gerhard leaned toward his ex-wife, now holding a silver serving tray, and dropped a stack of $100 bills onto it. George Gerhard always tips his failures generously. The sound of the money hitting the tray was soft. The silence that followed was. 400 guests turned to look. She didn't react. Not to the money. Not to the laughter. Not to the way he said her name like he still owned it. Kimberly, Lugo, had learned how to survive humiliation. 7 years ago, this same man had her arrested for stealing her own work. Tonight, he wanted an audience. What he didn't notice was the man sitting alone at the far end of the VIP section, dressed in black, unmoving, watching. And when that man finally stood up, the entire room would change. If you believe karma has perfect timing, hit like. If you've ever seen someone abuse their power, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And subscribe, because the shift that's coming is something no one in that ballroom was ready for. Comes next. I have another story dropping tomorrow that you will not want to sleep on. Now let's go back 7 years. 7 years ago, George Gerhard destroyed his wife's life in under 12 hours. He called the police and accused her of stealing proprietary company documents. The documents were hers. 5 years of research. A patented logistics algorithm. An entire business model she had built before and during their marriage. While she sat in a holding cell, he filed the patents under his own name. The next morning, he incorporated the company. The week after that, he gave an interview about his deeply troubled ex-wife. The charges were dropped. There was never any real evidence, because there was never any real crime. But it didn't matter. The story had already spread. Her name was already damaged. Her industry contacts stopped returning calls. George rose. She disappeared. She moved into a studio apartment above a laundromat. She worked 3 jobs. She stopped fighting. And for 7 years, she stayed invisible. Until tonight. Tonight, she was working the VIP floor of the Aldridge Grand Hotel's autumn charity auction, the city's most exclusive event. 400 guests. 12 VIP tables. And at table 1, the man who stole her life. He saw her. And he smiled. The uniform helped. That was the thing nobody told you about starting over, that there was a strange mercy in having your identity decided for you each morning. White button-down, pressed black apron, hair pulled back tight enough to mean business. No choices, no negotiations with the mirror, just the mechanical dignity of a person with somewhere to be and something to carry. Kimberly had been dressing for other people's evenings for 3 years now. She had learned to move through grandeur without being touched by it, to pour champagne into crystal worth more than her monthly rent and feel nothing but the professional satisfaction of not spilling a drop. Tonight was the Aldridge Grand, the crown jewel. She arrived at 4:30 for the 5 o'clock briefing, taking the service entrance on Carver Street the way she always did, past the dumpsters and the cigarette break awning where the kitchen staff gathered between rushes. She liked this entrance. She liked the honesty of it, the way the back of a beautiful building always told the truth about what kept it running. The event manager, a thin, precise woman named Sandra who communicated mostly through clipboard gestures, moved the staff through the evening's itinerary with the focus of a general preparing for an invasion. The autumn charity auction, 400 guests, 12 tables in the main ballroom, a VIP section cordoned off along the east wall with its own service rotation. Dress code, black tie, donations expected to exceed 3 million. Kimberly wrote nothing down. She never needed to. She had learned that listening completely was the closest thing to invisibility, that a woman who asked no questions and made no errors became, eventually, part of the architecture. She was assigned to the VIP rotation, table 1 through 8. She noted it without feeling anything particular about it. VIP meant better tips on paper, though in practice the wealthier the guest, the more invisible the staff were expected to be. She had worked enough of these rooms to know that the people at table 1 did not see her. They saw their own reflections in the polish of the tray. She collected her section assignments, exchanged a quiet nod with Marcus, a bartender she'd worked alongside enough times to have developed the wordless shorthand of people who share a shift without sharing a life, and began her prep. The ballroom was still being dressed when she walked it for the first time. She moved through it methodically, the way a surgeon might study an operating theater before the patient arrived, checking sightlines, locating the service corridor exits, noting which tables sat closest to the staging area. She had learned early that the best servers weren't reactive. They anticipated. They understood the room before the room became something that could hurt you. Chandeliers hung low enough to catch the gold in the floral arrangements. The tables were set with the kind of precision that required rulers. At the center of the VIP section, table 1 sat slightly apart from the others, its chairs upholstered in deep burgundy, a small brass placard at the head, confirming what the whole room's arrangement had already announced. This was where the evening's gravity would collect. She straightened a water glass that didn't need straightening and moved on. By 6:15, the guests had begun to arrive. Kimberly worked the outer edge of the room, ferrying champagne from the bar to the early clusters of people finding their tables, men in tuxedos who spoke too loudly, women who laughed at precisely calibrated volumes, the whole performative ritual of people reminding each other of their own importance. She moved between them like water finding gaps in stone, present and unnoticed. That was the goal. That had always been the goal. She was rounding the east corridor with a freshly loaded tray when she heard the room's ambient noise shift, that subtle drop in collective volume that a crowd makes when something worth looking at has arrived. She didn't turn immediately. She had learned not to be curious about other people's entrances. She turned at the service threshold, ready to begin the VIP rotation, and felt the tray grow heavy in her hands. Not from the weight of the glasses, from the sudden and complete inability to process what her eyes were telling her. At the far end of table 1, already seated, already working the room with the ease of a man who had never once questioned his right to occupy its center, was George Gerhard. He hadn't seen her yet. She had 3 seconds, maybe 4, before that changed. She used them to breathe. She had been so proud of the binders. That was the detail that came back to her now, standing at the edge of the ballroom with a tray in her hands and her past 20 feet away in a tuxedo. Not the algorithm, not the 5 years of research. The binders, forest green, spine labeled in her own handwriting, organized with the obsessive precision of a woman who had grown up with nothing and learned early that the only way to protect a dream was to document it. She had built the logistics model from scratch in the second bedroom of the house they'd shared on Mercer Hill. George had called it her project, the way indulgent husbands refer to hobbies, with a patience that she had mistaken for years for support. He had read every page. She understood that now. The night it ended had been a Tuesday in late October, cold enough for the furnace to be running, warm enough inside that she'd been working in just a t-shirt, cross-referencing distribution data on her laptop, when she heard his key in the lock 3 hours earlier than expected. She had looked up smiling. That was the part that still had the power to hollow her out, that she had looked up smiling. George had not come alone. 2 men she didn't recognize stood behind him in the doorway, both in suits, one carrying a leather portfolio. George's expression was one she had never seen on him before and took her several long seconds to correctly identify. Not anger, not guilt, the specific flatness of a man executing a plan. He told her there were some concerns about the company's intellectual property. He used the word concerns the way lawyers used it, drained of its human meaning, sharpened into a legal instrument. He told her that certain documents appeared to have been taken from the firm without authorization. She had laughed, actually laughed because she assumed she had misunderstood him. The documents he was referring to were hers. Developed before their marriage, refined during it, housed in her name on the shared server she had set up and maintained. The patents were pending under her name. She had the timestamps, the drafts, the version histories going back 4 years. She had the binders. She told him all of this. Her voice was steady. She was not frightened yet. George looked at her with that flat expression and said he'd had the server access logs reviewed, that her credentials had been used to move files, that regardless of origin, the current legal structure of their shared assets complicated her claim considerably. She understood then. Not completely. The full architecture of what he had done would take months to map, but enough. The marriage had not been falling apart. It had been a closing argument. Every dinner, every weekend trip, every moment of apparent normalcy over the past year had been the careful behavior of a man who had already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for the paperwork to be ready. The police arrived 11 minutes later. She had not known he'd already called them. She stood in her own hallway and watched two officers she'd done nothing to deserve step through her front door, and she felt the specific, nauseating vertigo of a person watching the world rewrite itself in real time. One of them was almost apologetic. The other wasn't. They told her there was an allegation of theft of proprietary materials. They told her she needed to come with them. She asked if she could get her jacket. They said yes. She remembered walking to the closet, pulling it from the hanger, and thinking with eerie calm that she needed to remember every detail of this moment, that she would need it later, would need to be able to describe the exact quality of the light and the sound of George's voice when he told the officer, "I appreciate you coming out," as though they were contractors he'd hired, as though she were a problem he was having removed from the premises. The charges didn't survive contact with a serious attorney. There was nothing real to charge her with. The paper trail was hers, always had been, and even George's restructured filing couldn't fully erase 4 years of digital fingerprints. But by the time that became clear, the patents had been absorbed into the corporate entity George incorporated the morning after her arrest. By the time that became clear, the press had already run the interview. By the time that became clear, it didn't matter anymore. She had looked up smiling. She repositioned the tray in her hands, squared her shoulders, and walked into the VIP section. The first thing she lost was her address. Not immediately. She'd held on to the apartment on Delmore Street for 4 months after the arrest, running through her savings with the methodical dread of a person watching a clock they cannot stop. The legal fees alone had consumed most of what she'd set aside. The rest went to the ordinary cruelty of existing. Rent, food, the phone bills she kept paying because she could not afford to be unreachable. She moved out on a Wednesday morning before the neighbors were awake, 1 carload. She had been ruthless about what she took, only what she could carry, only what was irreplaceable. She left the furniture. She left the good dishes. She left the version of herself that had believed in the house on Mercer Hill and drove to a sublet in a part of the city she'd never had reason to visit before. The sublet became a studio. The studio became a room in a shared house. Each move was smaller and faster than the one before it, the geography of a life compressing under pressure. She found the first job inside a week. A copy center downtown, opening shift, which meant she was up at 5 and running on the specific exhaustion of someone whose sleep had stopped being restful and become merely a biological requirement to be met and moved past. She was good at it. The work was precise and impersonal, and precision was one of the few things that had survived the wreckage intact. But the hours were capped, and the pay was structured around the assumption that everyone doing the job had somewhere softer to land. So she added the second job. Evenings at a dry cleaner 3 blocks from the sublet, steaming and pressing other people's formal wear, which had its own particular irony she chose not to examine too closely. She worked Tuesday through Saturday, 5 to 9, and spent her breaks eating whatever she'd packed that morning, standing near the back door where the heat from the machines was almost comfortable in winter. The third job came 6 months in, when the math still didn't clear. Weekends at a catering company, which was how she'd eventually moved into hotel service work, not because she'd planned it, but because she was reliable and quiet and showed up exactly when she said she would. And in the service industry, those qualities opened doors that credentials alone could not. She did not tell people her history. She had tried it once, early on, a moment of misplaced honesty with a supervisor she'd thought she could trust, and watched the woman's expression move through sympathy into discomfort into the specific wariness of someone recalculating a hearing decision. After that, she kept it simple. She was between careers. She was getting back on her feet, the phrases people nodded at without needing more. She followed George's trajectory the way you follow a storm on a weather map, not because you want to, but because knowing where it is feels safer than not knowing. His company launched officially 14 months after her arrest, the logistics model she'd built repackaged under a name she didn't recognize into an industry she had once been days away from entering on her own terms. The press coverage was generous. The profile in the business journal described him as a self-made visionary with an instinct for identifying underserved markets. There was a photograph of him at a conference, mid-gesture, the kind of man the camera found naturally. The Man of the Year announcement came in the spring of the second year. She read it on her phone during a break at the dry cleaner, steam from the press still damp on her forearms, and felt something shift in her chest that she would not give the dignity of a name. She put the phone away. She picked up the next shirt. She was not without moments of near collapse. There were nights when the weight of it all descended with a completeness that made breathing feel like an act of stubbornness, when the distance between who she had been and who she was now seemed not like a gap that could be crossed, but like a fact of the landscape, permanent, geological. On those nights, she allowed herself exactly 1 hour of it. She had learned to be disciplined even about despair. Then she got up the next morning and put on the uniform and went back to work. She had been doing that for 7 years, moving through grand rooms, carrying other people's celebrations on a silver tray, invisible by design, surviving by increments, waiting without quite admitting to herself that she was waiting for something to finally shift. She heard about him before she saw him. That was how it always worked with men like Dominic Cross. The room processed his arrival in layers, first the staff, then the perimeter guests, then the inner circle, a ripple moving inward from the edges like something dropped into still water. She caught it first in Marcus, who set down the bottle he was polishing with a care that had nothing to do with the bottle. Then in Sandra, whose clipboard lowered 2 inches and whose eyes moved to the entrance with an expression Kimberly had never seen on her before. Something between professional alertness and the instinct to be very, very still. She turned. He came through the main entrance alone, which was the first thing that separated him from every other powerful man in the room. No entourage. No handler moving ahead to clear the social path. Just a man in a black suit that had been cut for his specific body, walking at the unhurried pace of someone who had never once in his life needed to signal his own importance. He was younger than she expected, mid-40s, dark-haired, a jaw that looked like it had been decided rather than grown. There was ink visible above his collar, the edge of something larger underneath, and he wore it the way certain men wore old scars, not displayed, not hidden, simply present. The room adjusted around him. That was the only way to describe it. Conversations didn't stop so much as recalibrate, voices dropping half a register without their owners seeming to notice, bodies shifting in their chairs with the unconscious animal awareness of proximity to something that existed outside the normal hierarchy of the evening. He accepted a glass of water from a passing server without looking at them and moved toward the far end of the VIP section with the ease of a man who had already mapped the room before entering it. He chose the seat with its back to the wall and its sightline to the door, which told her everything she needed to know about the nature of his habits. She watched him for exactly as long as professional curiosity permitted, and then returned to her rotation. She did not immediately connect him to the memory. It came to her gradually, the way names surface when you stop trying to force them, in fragments, assembling themselves quietly at the edge of her attention while she worked. 2 years ago, the hospital on Clement Street, the one she'd passed every morning on the way to the copy center. She had been covering a catering shift for a colleague, a small private function in one of the hospital's administrative suites, donors, board members, the careful social machinery of institutional fundraising. She had arrived early to help with setup and taken a wrong turn down a corridor that led to the oncology waiting area. There had been a woman sitting alone in a row of plastic chairs. Older, small, dressed with a formality that suggested the clothes had been chosen carefully for a day that required courage. She was holding a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold and staring at a point on the floor with the exhausted precision of someone doing very hard, invisible work. Kimberly had almost kept walking. She had learned to keep walking, but something about the particular quality of the woman's stillness, the dignity of it, the isolation of it, had stopped her in a way she couldn't have articulated. She had sat down beside her. She had not said anything meaningful. She had simply asked if she'd like a fresh coffee, and when the woman said yes, she had gone and gotten it proper coffee from the staff room, not the waiting area machine, and sat with her for 11 minutes until a doctor appeared at the corridor door, and the woman stood and smoothed her coat and said very quietly, "Thank you, you have no idea," and walked toward whatever news was waiting. Kimberly had not asked her name. She had not thought about the encounter again with any particular frequency. It was a small human thing, unremarkable in isolation, the kind of moment that doesn't announce its own significance. She looked at the man at the end of table 8, the quality of his stillness, the architecture of his face, and understood with a slow, certain clarity where she had seen those features before. The woman in the waiting room had shared his jawline, his eyes. He was looking directly at her. Not with recognition performing itself across his face the way people did when they wanted credit for remembering. Quietly, carefully, the way a man looks at something he has already decided matters. He did not look away. Neither did she. It started with the wine. She had been expecting it, on some level, from the moment she'd seen him at table 1. George Gerhard had never been the kind of man who let an opportunity pass without extracting maximum use from it, and the sight of his ex-wife in a serving apron was exactly the kind of opportunity he had been built to exploit. She had hoped, with the practical optimism of someone accustomed to hopping without expecting, that the room would be too crowded, the evening too structured, his ego too occupied with its primary performance to bother with her specifically. She had underestimated him. She always had, right up until she hadn't. She was pouring for the couple at table 3 when she felt his eyes find her. Not saw, felt. The particular weight of a gaze that isn't curious but calculating, that isn't looking at you so much as pricing you. She completed the pour without a tremor, thanked the guests, and turned toward the service corridor. "Excuse me." His voice had not changed. That was another thing she would add to the list of the world's small injustices, that a man could do what George had done and still carry the same voice. Warm, textured, calibrated for rooms exactly like this one. She turned with the professional blankness she had spent years perfecting. He was half risen from his chair, one hand extended toward his wine glass with the casual authority of a man accustomed to being reached for. His eyes were moving over her with an expression the table couldn't read, but she could, the suppressed pleasure of it, the private amusement, the particular satisfaction of a cat that has spotted something cornered. "I think we need a refill at table 1. She crossed the room and poured. She kept her eyes on the glass. He kept his on her face, performing a slow, theatrical recognition for the benefit of the guests around him. Eyebrows lifting, head tilting, the whole pantomime of surprise assembled with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it. "Kimberly," he said it the way you name something you own. "My God, I didn't realize you were," a pause weighted with implication, "working this event." Several heads turned. That had been the point. She said it was a busy evening and moved to return to the service corridor. She had taken 4 steps when she heard the glass go over. The sound was too deliberate. Wine glasses at events like this were weighted for stability. They didn't tip from nothing. She knew before she turned that his hand had helped it, that the arc of dark red spreading across the linen had been authored. "Oh, that's unfortunate," George said to the table, his tone carrying the practiced regret of a man who had never been inconvenienced by a mess in his life. "I'm so sorry. Would someone be able to," his eyes finding her across the room, his hand gesturing at the spreading stain with the benign helplessness of a man who had simply had an accident, "get that cleaned up." She got the cloth. She came back. She worked the stain from the edges inward the way she had been trained, keeping her movements efficient and her face empty. And she was aware of the table watching her with the collective discomfort of people who sense they are witnessing something with a subtext they haven't been given access to. and of George watching her with no discomfort at all. "It's such important work," he said to the man beside him, not quietly. "The service industry, really, I have tremendous respect for people who find their level." Quiet laughter from somewhere to his left. She finished with the cloth and straightened. The second accident happened 12 minutes later. A water glass this time, the full contents across the edge of the table and onto the floor in a sheet, and she was summoned back to crouch and mop it while the table sat above her, and George explained to his neighbor, unprompted, that he believed in the dignity of all honest labor, that he himself had never been too proud for hard work, that some people simply made choices in life that led them to certain places. By the third incident, she understood the choreography completely. He was not trying to embarrass her privately. He was curating an audience, building a context, laying the groundwork for something larger with the patience of a man who had always preferred his cruelty to have witnesses. She collected the cloth and walked back to the service corridor and stood for a moment in the quiet of the back hallway, alone, her hands braced against the wall. From the far end of the ballroom, she did not see Dominic Cross set down his water glass and turn to watch table one with the slow, focused attention of a man who has just seen enough. The thing about cruelty in elegant rooms is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It moves the way smoke moves, low, patient, finding every gap, filling every space it isn't actively kept out of. It borrows the language of concern and the posture of civility, and it spreads through a crowd not like fire but like weather, a shift in atmospheric pressure that everyone feels and nobody names. George had seated it perfectly. She could see that now. The spills had not been about the floor. They had been about the story, the visual shorthand of a woman on her knees, in a ballroom full of people who needed only the thinnest narrative to organize their discomfort into something that felt like judgment rather than participation. He had given them a frame, and they had stepped into it the way people always stepped into frames, gratefully, without examination, relieved to know where to stand. She first noticed it at table 5. A woman in a column of champagne silk leaned toward her companion as Kimberly set down the appetizer course, and though the words themselves were swallowed by the ambient noise of the room, the shape of the sentence was clear, and the glance that accompanied it, brief, sideways. Calibrated to be seen by the subject without appearing to be, was a language Kimberly had become fluent in over 7 years of service work. She knew that glance. She had been collecting them since the morning after George's press interview ran. She moved to table 6. A man she half recognized from the business pages, something in finance, the particular brand of gray-templed confidence that finance produced in men of a certain age, stopped mid-sentence as she reached across to collect an empty glass and said to his wife, just loudly enough, that it was remarkable what people ended up doing. His wife made a sound that was technically sympathetic and substantively not. Table 7 was quieter about it, which was almost worse. A young couple, early 30s, the kind who had come into money recently enough to still be performing it. They simply watched her with the undisguised curiosity of people at a zoo, following her movements with an attention that had nothing to do with the service she was providing and everything to do with the story they'd absorbed from the other side of the room. She kept moving. That was the discipline of it, to keep moving, to let the circuit of the rotation impose its own rhythm on a body that wanted badly to stop, to find a corridor, to be somewhere that did not have eyes. But the room was doing something else now, something she hadn't anticipated. The guests around George's table had begun to perform for him. A woman to his left had apparently asked, with the bright, surgical curiosity of the socially comfortable, how Kimberly had come to be in service work, and George had answered with the long, sorrowful patience of a man burdened by someone else's history. She caught the cadence of it across the room without the words, the slow headshake, the glance toward the ceiling that communicated more than language. The woman had pressed her fingers to her collarbone. Others had leaned in. By the time Kimberly came back around with the next course, the table had the specific hush of people who have just been told something they feel they shouldn't repeat and fully intend to. She was reaching across to place the dish when she heard the word clearly for the first time. Unstable. Said not to her but about her, from 2 feet away, by a man in a dinner jacket who had not registered her as a person capable of hearing. Said with the reflexive confidence of someone repeating information they have accepted without question, passing it along like currency, valuable precisely, because it cost him nothing and bought him a moment of George Gerhard's attention. She set the plate down. She straightened. She turned toward the service corridor and walked, and the walk itself required everything she had left, every year of practice, every morning of putting on the uniform and deciding again to survive, every private vow made in the small hours of apartments she couldn't quite afford, all of it recruited now just to keep her spine straight across 20 feet of marble floor, while a room full of people who did not know her name decided they knew everything about her. She made it to the corridor. She stood in the half-dark with her back against the wall and her tray held flat against her chest like armor, and she closed her eyes. And for the first time in 7 years, she felt the specific exhaustion of a woman who is no longer certain she can keep choosing this. From somewhere in the ballroom, a microphone clicked on. Dominic Cross had not wanted to come tonight. That was the truth of it, stripped of the professional reasoning he had offered his associate when declining the first invitation, and the second, and the third. Charity auctions were performances, and performances required an audience willing to be performed at, and Dominic had long since lost the patience for rooms that confused the appearance of generosity with the thing itself. He had come because Marco had asked him to, and Marco was one of perhaps 4 people on Earth whose requests carried the specific weight of obligation. And because the foundation being honored tonight had done genuine work in neighborhoods that the city's official generosity had never quite reached. He had intended to write the check, stay 90 minutes and leave. He had been here for 3 hours. He knew why. He had known from the moment he walked through the door and saw her moving through the room with the focused quiet of a woman who had learned to make herself small in spaces that should have been hers. He had recognized her the way you recognize something you had carried a long time without knowing you were carrying it, with the specific relief of a thing finally placed. The hospital on Clement Street, 26 months ago. His mother had been diagnosed in August. By October, the treatment had begun producing its own category of damage alongside the damage it was meant to repair, and there had been a morning, one of several, but this one particular morning, when Dominic had looked at his mother sitting in that waiting room and understood with a completeness he was not accustomed to that there were categories of helplessness that money could not restructure. He could pay for the best oncologist in the state. He could have the hospital's administrative wing named after his grandmother. He could not sit beside his mother in that plastic chair and absorb what she was absorbing. So he had stood in the corridor instead, because he was a man who had learned to put distance between himself and the things he could not control. And he had watched through the glass partition as his mother sat alone with her cold coffee and her dignity and the enormous private work of being frightened. He had seen the woman stop. She was in catering whites, a lanyard from some hotel event visible at her collar, clearly in the wrong wing of the building, moving with the slightly lost purpose of someone who had taken a wrong turn. She had almost kept going. He had seen the moment she didn't, seen her redirect toward his mother with the quiet directness of someone responding to a thing they couldn't justify ignoring. He had watched her sit down. He had watched her leave and come back with the coffee. He had watched her stay, not hovering, not performing concern, simply present in the way that presence is sometimes the only thing that matters. 11 minutes. He had timed it without meaning to, the habit of a man for whom details were survival. When his mother came out after her consultation, he had met her at the corridor door and she had taken his arm and said, almost as an afterthought, that a kind young woman had sat with her. She hadn't gotten her name. He had not forgotten the face. He had, over the following months, looked into it, not intrusively, not with the full weight of his resources, but enough to satisfy the particular discomfort of owing a debt he couldn't yet repay. What he had found had clarified, slowly, into a picture that produced in him a cold and specific anger. The patents, the arrest, the press interview with its careful character demolition, the 7 years of erasure. He had read the original filings, had people who understood the industry examine the timeline, and had arrived at a conclusion that required no legal expertise, only the straightforward application of knowing, intimately and professionally, what it looked like when someone took something that didn't belong to them and built an empire on it. He had filed the information away. He had told himself the moment would come. He watched her now from across the room, moving through the corridor doorway with her spine still straight and her tray held flat against her chest, and the particular look on her face of a woman spending her last reserves, and he recognized that look too. He had seen it on his mother in that waiting room. The look of someone who has been strong for so long that strength itself has become the cage. The microphone clicked on across the ballroom. George Gerhard's voice filled the room. Dominic set down his water glass with a soft, final sound. He had waited long enough. The microphone loved George Gerhard. Or rather, George Gerhard loved the microphone, which was a different thing entirely, and he had long ago perfected the performance of the distinction. He took the podium the way he took every room, as though it had been constructed specifically in anticipation of his arrival, as though the lights and the audience and the occasion itself had simply been waiting for him to complete them. The applause was generous. It always was. He had spent 7 years purchasing exactly this quality of applause, and he understood its maintenance the way a gardener understood soil, what it needed, what depleted it, how to keep it producing. He began with the charity. He was practiced enough to begin with the charity. He spoke about the foundation with the fluent emotion of a man who had rehearsed sincerity until it was indistinguishable from the real thing, the underserved communities, the work that remained, the responsibility of those who had been fortunate enough to succeed. He used the word journey twice and humbled once, which was the precise calibration of a man who knew that more would tip into parody. Several people at the tables nearest the stage nodded with the reflexive approval of an audience being told what they already believed about themselves. Kimberly heard it from the corridor. She had not moved from her position against the wall. She had told herself she was regrouping, that in 60 seconds she would straighten and go back out and finish the rotation with the professionalism that had carried her this far, that she had survived worse than a ballroom's opinion, and she would survive this too. But her legs had made their own decision about the 60 seconds, and she was still there when his voice reached her through the service door, warm, textured, filling the room with the ease of something that had always belonged there. She should have gone further down the corridor. She understood that later. Instead, she stayed and listened and heard the speech begin to turn. It happened gradually, with the skill of a man who understood that directness was a liability and implication was a weapon. He began talking about success and its discontents, the people who could not sustain it, who mistook opportunity for entitlement, who took what others had built and called it collaboration. He used the word troubled in the same breath as the word brilliant, which was a particular construction she recognized from the press interview, the same architecture of apparent generosity sharpening itself into a blade. Several guests shifted in their seats. Then he said her name. Not cruelly, not with the naked contempt he had used in the service corridor. He said it with the careful sorrow of a man revisiting a painful chapter. Someone I once tried to help, someone I believed in, someone whose situation reminds us all that success without character is a foundation built on sand. And the room received it the way rooms received things said at microphones, with the uncritical deference of an audience that has outsourced its judgment to the person holding the amplification. He was looking toward the service corridor as he said it. He could not see her in the dark of it, but he knew she was there. That was the point of it, not just to address the room, but to reach her in her hiding place, to follow her even there, to make certain that there was no corner of the evening she could occupy without his voice finding her in it. She pushed through the service door before she had decided to. She was in the ballroom again, tray in hand, standing at the edge of the east wall, and George was at the podium 40 feet away, and the room was full of people turning to locate the subject of the speech now that she had provided herself, and she understood with cold clarity that she had walked into exactly what he had designed, that the exit from the corridor had been the final move he'd been engineering all evening, that he had needed her visible and exposed in the moment of her own nomming. His smile, from behind the microphone was almost imperceptible. Almost. She stood straight. She held the tray. She met his eyes across the room with the stillness of a woman who had nothing left to protect and had therefore, in this moment, nothing left to lose. The crowd's attention settled on her like weather. George drew breath for the next sentence. He did not get to say it. Because somewhere in the middle of the room, at a table set for 8, a chair moved back from the table with a sound that was small and absolute, and somehow louder than everything else in the room. And Dominic Cross stood up. He didn't speak immediately. That was the first thing. That was the thing that silenced the room more completely than any word could have, the simple fact of him standing without speaking, in the particular way that men who have never needed volume to be heard simply stand, and letting the room catch up to what was happening. It took approximately 4 seconds. Dominic Cross was patient enough to wait for all 4 of them. George's smile held at the podium. For 3 of those seconds it held, sustained by the momentum of a man who had not yet processed that the evening's architecture had shifted beneath him. He looked at Dominic with the mildly inquiring expression of a speaker encountering a minor interruption, the implicit confidence of a man behind a microphone assuming his authority over the room remained structurally intact. The 4th second ended. The smile didn't disappear so much as become unsupported, a structure whose foundation had been quietly removed, still standing only because it hadn't yet registered the removal. Something moved behind George's eyes, a recalibration. The first cold touch of understanding that the power dynamic in the room had changed hands without any formal announcement. Dominic spoke at a conversational volume. He didn't need more. George. Not Mr. Gerhard. Not the title the evening's program had printed in embossed lettering. George. Said with the flat, almost bored familiarity of a man removing a pretension the way you'd remove a price tag, not unkindly, simply because it had no business being there. The room was absolute in its silence. I think you can stop there. 400 people were not breathing. George opened his mouth. Something about his face suggested words were forming, the reflexive machinery of a man who had talked his way into and out of everything for 20 years beginning its automatic operation. But the words didn't come. Because Dominic was already moving, unhurried, without the performative weight that men of lesser authority used when they wanted to be watched, simply crossing the room the way he crossed every room, as though the space between where he was and where he intended to be had already agreed to accommodate him. He stopped beside Kimberly. He did not look at her immediately. He held George's gaze across the room with the steady patience of a man who understood that in negotiations of all kinds, the first person to redirect their attention conceded the ground. He let George stand at the empty microphone for a moment that lasted considerably longer than its actual duration. Then he turned to Kimberly, and his expression did something that the room would discuss in various configurations for years afterward. It didn't perform warmth, didn't announce itself, simply changed in the small, specific way that faces change when they arrive at something true. Ms. Lugo, his voice was still conversational, still carrying, effortlessly, to every corner of the room. I apologize for not finding you earlier in the evening. I should have been more attentive. She looked at him. She trusted nothing yet. 7 years had made her careful about things that appeared in the shape of rescue. He understood that. It was in the way he waited, not rushing her response, not filling the silence with the performance of his own generosity, simply standing beside her as though the position was one he had every intention of maintaining. Then he turned back to the room. For anyone who isn't aware, he said, with the mild, informative tone of a man correcting a small factual error at a board meeting, Kimberly Lugo is the architect of the logistics framework that built Gerhard Solutions from the ground up. The patents were hers. The research was hers. The company was hers. A pause that was not dramatic but simply accurate. The rest is a matter of record for anyone willing to look at the original filing dates. I have people who have looked. The room turned to George. George Gerhard was still at the podium. He had not moved, which had stopped looking like composure sometime in the last 30 seconds and started looking like the temporary stillness of a structure about to fail. The microphone in front of him was live. He said nothing into it. The silence he produced was the loudest thing he had contributed to the evening. Dominic addressed him directly one final time, and his voice was not raised and not unkind, simply the voice of a man closing a door. "You should sit down, George. Someone will have questions for you shortly. You'll want to have your paperwork ready." He did not watch to see if George complied. He turned back to Kimberly with the quiet finality of a man whose business in one direction was complete. Around them, the room began to fracture, voices rising in the particular register of people revising everything they thought they knew, phones appearing above the tablecloths, the rapid quiet collapse of a reputation in real time. Kimberly became aware, gradually, that she was still holding the tray. She lowered it to her side. She straightened to her full height. She looked at Dominic Cross in the middle of the room that had, 40 minutes ago, been assembled against her, and she felt something that was not yet relief and not quite safety, but was perhaps the first tremor of both. The specific sensation of a woman who has been holding a door shut against the dark for 7 years and has just, for the first time, felt someone else's hand against it. "My mother spoke about you," Dominic said quietly, just for her, "for a long time." Kimberly said nothing. Her throat had made other arrangements. From the podium, unattended and still live, the microphone carried the sound of an empty room waiting for a speech that was never going to be finished. George Gerhard sat down.